The macro trends that are set to define the 2023 season. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, we're kind of going to do one of our more free-flowing sort of theory conversations today. It's something I sort of pitched to you. I've seen a lot of conversation, a lot of chatter on Twitter and elsewhere, a lot of ways that people are talking about the 2023 season, takes that are being formulated. And I think there's just a little bit of a misunderstanding still about what the 2022 season was and how these macro trends. I think it's one of the biggest storylines going into 2023 fantasy football. So I'm really excited to get your thoughts on it. We often talked about like not trying to over predict what offenses might look like, being aware of uncertainty, seeking upside almost at all costs, just sort of knowing that circumstances can break right for players in ways that are sort of difficult to see in advance. But I also think there is maybe too much of a focus on player profiles right now across the fantasy industry and not enough focus on what some of these offenses actually are or could be as a result of the ways that the game has evolved, the ways that defenses were playing in last year's, cover two shells, all these things that we talked about last year. I think it's very likely we're going to see a lot of that again in 2023 for reasons we'll get into. You have to understand the motivation from the defenses and from the offenses and what they're trying to accomplish. But I mean, the NFL as a history is a sport that goes through ebbs and flows. It's often referred to as a copycat league. You have defensive schemes that are devised to beat the offensive trend of that day, and then that defensive scheme works, and then the offense does something different, and then the defense has to adjust. There are rules changes that dramatically impact things. And we're in an era right now that I think especially if you start back maybe a decade ago when passing really, I think, took off. It's always been on an upward trajectory over the course of the NFL's history. But you start around there and you understand what has happened, how that impacted the stats in each of the seasons over the last decade or so. And you have a really, I think, different perspective about what to expect for 2023, or at least that's the way I see it. But before we get into like all of that, what are sort of your, I guess, initial thoughts on this? Because, I mean, as I've been thinking through this, there's just like no one else I wanted to chat with about it.
It's absolutely fascinating. And I think that one of the fun things is understanding the macro trends and how those are going to shift what you see on Sunday. And then thinking through the fallout as we try and decide what general structures are going to be effective in fantasy. Not that we're exclusively looking at fantasy football, but obviously we're playing a lot. That's, more or less what this show is about. But you think through what's been happening and then what does that mean? You think about best ball and the wide receiver avalanches and how ADP has moved in the direction of those top wide receivers, which again isn't just because of these macro trends. It's also about very specific player developments, where in 2021 you had the zero RB guys hit in the playoffs, and in 2022 you had the dead zone guys hit. Those are two things that may not carry over regardless of the macro trends. And what we see in best ball may be a throwback to other years. So even though we're looking at 2 years worth of data for Underdog, obviously we're looking for more years when we talk about FFPC, we can draw a lot of bad conclusions when we think about the shape of scoring, mimicking things that were actually pretty unusual in the last 2 years. But then we also have this environment in which we're looking at the macro trends on the NFL level, but then when you break it down to individual teams, it becomes, again, just endlessly fascinating, where we have very big differences in how offenses work based on whether or not you have a pass-oriented QB or if you have a hybrid QB. And then certainly you might argue that there's sort of a third category, which is bad QB, and what that means for those three categories of NFL teams, because they're very different offenses. And so defenses are going to have quite different incentives when they face those three types of teams. And then even beyond that, you're going to have some very team specific differences based on the actual players who are in those roles. And then the defenses you face within the context, layering on top what your team incentives are at any given point in the season and then overall for the season. Because obviously you're going to have different incentives for the Philadelphia Eagles than you have for the Indianapolis Colts, even though ideally maybe those teams run in a fairly similar way. You think about teams like the Atlanta Falcons and the Chicago Bears, and they're going to have very different incentives in 2023 than what they had in 2022, where they were quite obviously just building. And so, especially when you're talking about teams that maybe are outlier-ish teams where their overall offense structure and their play calls are on the extreme end of how NFL football can work, that part is interesting just in and of itself, but also when we're talking about them potentially taking a jump for this year. And so, I mean, Ben, this is a topic that we could do 20, 30 hours on, but I'm excited to, do 50 minutes or so and, play with some ideas. That's mostly what we're going to be doing. We're not going to try and come up with any definitive answer and say you've got to draft this way in 2023 as a result of these numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. But you do hit on several of the key points. I think one of the best points you just made was the discussion of how, the individual trends that influence the fantasy football in a given year, whether it was, the dead zone backs hitting in a certain year or what have you, are going to be looked at. But we also have to layer in a separate thing about the league shifting and how that's impacting trends. And so like some of the reason that a certain position in fantasy is successful just relates to whether or not the other positions or the other areas of the draft, early, middle, late, whatever, experiences busts, poor play, injuries, whatever. Tight end is always an easy one because it's a onesie position. But for a stretch in the 2015 range, there was a late round tight end almost every year. George Kittle was a late round draft pick. The year he broke out, Delaney Walker was. Rookie year, Jordan Reed was the number one tight end in points per game in PPR leagues. These guys were all double-digit picks like year after year and had very strong seasons that were up around the top guys. At that time, Gronk, Jimmy Graham type top guys. But you would have looked at multi-year trends and said late round tight ends, it's easy to find a late round tight end that can come up and score a bunch of points. If you look at the most recent seasons, you're like, okay, well, it's Travis Kelce and nothing else matters, right? Like you have to take the first tight end or else you're screwed, especially last year where he scored over 100 PPR points more than any other tight end. No other tight end was over, I think it's like 215. And even that was like, the rest of that was a little subtle thing, but the rest of the tight end position very low in scoring. Usually there's at least a couple guys around 250. Last year, the tight end 2 was about 215, like 35 points lower, a couple points per game lower. And so that helped accentuate Travis Kelce's benefit, et cetera. You also mentioned the quarterback element, more mobile quarterbacks and how it's influencing offenses. It wasn't until just 4 years ago that we had more than one quarterback who had run for 1,000 yards. We had Mike Vick. Was the only quarterback who had ever done it until Lamar Jackson did it in 2019. Now, 3 of the last 4 seasons, we've had a 1,000-yard quarterback rusher. Lamar Jackson did it 2 years in a row. Fields just did it last year. We've also had 3, not including Fields last year, 3 750-plus yard rushers each of the last 2 years at the quarterback position. That's a big number as well. We talked about this a little bit with the Trey Lance discussions last year where I was doing projections into the number of attempts that quarterbacks can run for, because those numbers weren't. Cam Newton was one of the better running quarterbacks in the entire league between the Mike Vick era and the current era. He never hit 150 rush attempts, but he did hit 100 rush attempts several times. His career high was 754 yards rushing. That's the type of number we're having 3 guys a year hit now. And one of the points about the Trey Lance thing, I was talking about getting up to that 150 rush attempt number for a quarterback, which we have a lot of quarterbacks are hitting a lot closer to that type of number. We're getting more design runs, et cetera, which gets back to the macro team strategy level trends. I mentioned the 10 years ago thing. I've mentioned this on pods before that we've done for sure, Sean. Longtime Stealing Bananas listeners will remember this note. But in 2014, the NFL released a memo. It came from Dean Blandino, the guy we see on TV now. He was the director of officials at the time, that said they were going to emphasize defensive holding and illegal contact. And it changed the way the wide receiver position was played at that time. If you did research looking back, and RotoViz had at the time, it showed a strong correlation between weight and upside at wide receiver, because you had to be able to get through hand fighting at the wide receiver position. You look at the Super Bowl last year, Sean, Juju Smith-Schuster, everyone wanted to say that was a ticky-tack hold. Even the DB said that's what they call, because that's what they call in 2023. It's a different sport than when the Seahawks won the Super Bowl in 2013, and they got there by leading the league in defensive holding and illegal contact penalties. But it was before this memo came down, and they were public about, yeah, we're gonna hold on every single play, because you're not gonna throw a flag on every single play. You'll call some of them, but eventually we'll get away with some of them. And that was a part of their scheme, right? They ran a cover one or one deep safety, or a cover three. It can be referred to kind of either way. Defensive scheme. Earl Thomas was the one deep safety, which meant that the outside corners, Richard Sherman and Brandon Browner, had deep responsibility. The field gets cut up into thirds. Those guys were not necessarily burners, good cornerbacks, but they could be physical down the field when a vertical route came on the outside, which allowed them to have that deep responsibility and not need safety help over the top. When that rule changed, suddenly receivers could just run unrestricted past. The cover three defense was, there's other reasons, and people who know X's and O's are going to be able to slap me around on a lot of the things I'm going to say here, but this is sort of my understanding on it. But after 2014, we immediately saw more passing and more passing efficiency. And one of the big reasons was that cover three defense. Number one, I've seen smart X's and O's people talk about how there was a lot of guys that came out of Seattle, and that was the copycat thing. Gus Bradley went elsewhere. Dan Quinn went elsewhere, right? And those guys were teaching the cover three defense or bringing it to other offenses or defenses that, number one, didn't have Earl Thomas, who was probably just a unique safety capable of being the one single high safety and covering that much ground. And number two, no longer had the benefit of being able to hold in the defensive holding and illegal contact and all of those things that the outside corners were able to do. That was helped this cover three defense. And for a couple of years there, passing offenses were very successful attacking cover three shells or cover one, one deep safety, however you want to talk about this. I always thought of it as cover three. But then cover two over time has become back in vogue, right? And it's, cover two is the one where the cornerbacks don't have deep responsibility. They always talk about the cornerback cuts a guy loose on the sideline, and there's this gap between the corner and the safety coming over the top. And, 20 yards downfield on the sideline, there's this window in cover two. Defenses, I don't know exactly the X's and O's, the ways that the defenses are playing cover two at this day and age, et cetera. But it seems very clear that when defenses went back to that, they took the other safety. So like when you go back to the Seahawks team, Earl Thomas being one deep, what did that do for you? It meant that Cam Chancellor could come down in the box. Famous hit in the Super Bowl on Demaryius Thomas on a crossing pattern, lighting him up early in that game. And it was like, you're not even going to get these short, easy passes for the Broncos. So Cam Chancellor being free to roam in the middle of the field, almost like a linebacker as that other safety. That's something we don't see as much when in today's NFL with these two deep safety looks. So we saw passing blow up for a long time. We also saw, because of less defensive holding and illegal contact and those things, lighter receivers able to be more successful at the NFL level than they had been for a long time. Past data would have told you weight correlated really well with receiver scoring. It doesn't correlate as well now because of that rule change, in my opinion. I think it's super clear. Now receivers are allowed to run free. You can't hold them down. And so then immediately, if that rule change happens at the NFL level, the benefit of a lighter receiver is that they're faster, they're more agile. If you can't hold them, now they're definitely better than the heavier receivers in certain situations, right? Like, it immediately changes what wins at the NFL level. That sometimes takes a couple years to implement, but it becomes clear. And NFL teams have been drafting lighter and lighter receivers as a result, because they can put them out there and they can't be helped. They can't be, pulled back. They could for the history of the NFL up until 10 years ago. And now we've moved 10 years further and further and further towards this. So in the interim of those 10 years, one of the other data points, I wrote about some of this stuff, Sean, going back to, my first stint at RotoViz back, I remember in 2017, writing about the three wide receiver trend becoming a bigger trend. Remember, I wore it as kind of a badge of an honor at that time that I wrote about it one off season. And the next offseason, it seemed to be a really popular thing that was getting discussed more. I remember like Warren Sharp was writing about it in his book the next offseason, and I was like, I was ahead of Warren Sharp on this. But, people might remember that piece at RotoViz. I've referenced it before. One of the things that happened in the interim since that 2017 range, that I'm referring to when I was writing about it, I've been tracking it quite a bit. There was one year that was a big deal or not a big deal. It's kind of a footnote, but I thought it was a big deal. More defensive backs have been drafted than any other draft in NFL history. And people who followed my work for a lot of years will know that I talked about that, the impact of that. Well, that's defenses saying, and more 3 wide receiver offenses. We can't hold as much anymore. The offenses are becoming more shotgun heavy, more spread. We now need to get more DBs on the field. We need faster players on the field. We need to get into nickel formations, which means a 5th defensive back. Traditionally it was 4-3 or 3-4 fronts, which meant 7 defenders in the box between the defensive line and the linebackers. If you had 7 there, you have 11 players. There's 4 in the secondary. Any 4-3, 3-4 front means 4 secondary, 2 corners, 2 safeties. That kind of stuff isn't as common anymore because we're typically seeing 5 in the secondary, and then 6. One of those secondary players might be able to come down into the box, but you're talking about lighter defensive packages. And that's a big part of the shift that's happened with all these rules changes, all the things that have gone on, the ways that defenses have evolved. And what they did last year, the sort of end result of that over the decade of evolution, they started it really in 2020. 2020, massive offensive season, right? Like we have no fans in the stands. That was, one of the big reasons cited was there weren't fans. But I'm slightly skeptical. I mean, I think that was definitely part of it, but I think there was other elements of it too. The defenses really fought back in about the middle of 2021. We saw a lot of quarterbacks, ADOTs falling. I remember writing about this a lot in 2021. We talked about it last offseason. All of last year, we saw that same sort of environment that we saw sort of at the back end of 2021. Defenses are sitting back. They're putting more defensive backs on the field. And what they are doing from a strategy perspective with the current rules, we can't hold you. We can't stop you from running free in the secondary. So the way we have to stop you from scoring, and Shawn, you were great about talking about this in season last year, is we can't allow big plays in the passing game. We need to prevent explosives. We need to make you move the ball down the field slowly. So we're going to put more DBs on the field, more fast, quick guys that can cover a ton of ground. It's not just a cover 2 shell, because there's been cover 2 in the past before, but when the Tampa 2 was the big deal in cover 2 in the 2000s, the thing there was that the middle linebacker, who was a linebacker, would get depth. So you could attack the cover 2 between the safeties, or on the outsides and between the safeties. That was sort of the way to attack the cover 2. Get a deep route on both outside sidelines, so the safeties have to split. You also have a guy going up the seam. 2 deep safeties can't guard all 3 of those. But in the Tampa 2, the middle linebacker would follow that tight end up the seam, right? And so he would get depth too, and it almost turned into a cover 3 with the middle linebacker as your middle safety almost, as he's getting depth. The guy Derek Brooks could carry that tight end, as they would say. At least, again, this is my understanding. I'm just sitting here talking about something that's been on my mind because I feel like it's misunderstood, right? The cover 2 now is a cover 2 with an additional nickel defensive back on the field. It's a lighter formation. It doesn't require a linebacker to carry, up the seam or whatever. You're doing different things in the ways that your zones fit together and the ways that you can move the defensive backs around. You might even get to 6 defensive backs and be in a dime formation, right? And only have 4 down linemen and 1 linebacker on the field in obvious passing situations. Because receivers can run free, because you can't hold them, you want to keep everything in front. You want to create a tough environment for explosive plays. You're not going to get beat downfield, but you are going to give up more rushing efficiency, right? Because now you don't have all the linemen and the linebackers on the field. That's why last year, first time in NFL history, the league-wide average rush attempt was 4.5 yards per attempt. Now, Shawn, I mentioned this stat to you before we came on. You made a great point immediately. Some of that has to do with the quarterback, the increased quarterback rushing. Quarterbacks are more efficient running the ball than running backs are, and a big part of that increase certainly relates to that. But you go back to just 2017, running back efficiency was down to 4.1 yards per attempt. This is on a sample of over 10,000 carries. You look over a long term, you can go to Pro Football Reference, you can see team offensive league averages per team game over a long time. 4.0 was typically about the league average, 4.1, 4.2 sometimes. It gets up to about 4.3 in 2011, 2012. It was back down to 4.1 in 2017, as I mentioned. It's been 4.4 a couple times in the last 5 years, and then it was 4.5 last year. That's a big gap between those, 4.1, 4.0, 3.9 shifts that we typically saw to get all the way up to 4.5. A lot of increase in rushing efficiency. This is why we're seeing teams being willing to just keep calling the runs, because the defenses aren't trying to get them to stop doing that. It used to be a thing where, look, if you get ran all over, you get embarrassed, you're going to lose. There's a lot of schematic things that go into that. One of the things I was floating to you, Shawn, is I feel like, you go back to like the dominant Alabama SEC teams of 10 years ago when Derrick Henry was there. They could just run all over you even if you put 11 guys in the box. And that's when it's really demoralizing. If you can't stop the run, if you keep putting more and more guys in the box and they're just blocking everyone and bigger and stronger and faster than you, that's not what is happening with the current NFL rushing efficiency. I do want to figure out a way to do some research on like maybe explosive runs, league-wide, et cetera. To me, the increase in rushing efficiency feels like more 5, 7, 8, 9-yard runs, not more 60-yard TD runs. Like a few years ago, we had Jonathan Taylor breaking off long runs all the time. I don't think we had as many long touchdown runs last year. I could be wrong. And the ones we did, in my recollection, are mostly quarterbacks, Justin Fields, those types of players. But ultimately, you have a scheme that's also it's designed to stop explosive pass plays, I would argue, but also because it's lighter and faster in the second and third level, it's giving up ground at the line of scrimmage on run plays, but it also is probably stopping explosive run plays as well because they have more guys. You can't break through, when you have 7 guys in the box, 8 guys in the box, you break through that. We've all seen the 4th and 1 rush attempts where the defense loads the box and the running back finds a hole. And as soon as he breaks through, there's no second level of the defense. He's gone. He goes 40 yards for a TD on a 4th and 1 carry. The defenses are basically different than that, where they have the opposite of that, where they have a lot of extra guys in the second and third layer of the defenses. So even when a running back hits a hole, he's more likely to run into guys further down the field. Again, I would have to test that, but this is all sort of my understanding of the way that the NFL has evolved schematically. Defenses are copying this. They are making offenses move the ball a lot of plays, force them into third downs. So you talked a lot about this during the season last year. The ways that defenses were designed in 22 was trying to force offenses into more plays to get their points.
And I think the roots of this really stretch back a ways. And then that potentially gets amplified by all of these trends that you're discussing. But it's interesting when you think of some of the most successful coaches and understanding what the incentives are, pass game versus run game, and what the incentives are in terms of big plays versus forcing the opponent to make a lot of individually successful plays. You think back to Peyton Manning's height, and I remember very clearly before, I believe, an AFC Championship game, and they're interviewing Jeff Fisher, who himself was kind of a old school smash mouth coach. You'd think, okay, well, he's going to think you need to run the ball and stop the run. And what he's saying is you got to let the Colts run and don't let Peyton Manning beat you. You don't even really care if you stop them. You want to take the ball out of his hands. You want them to run as many plays as possible. The same kind of thing that you're trying to obviously do now against teams like a Patrick Mahomes. But you also think about the New England Patriots, and you think about the genius of Bill Belichick. And obviously, he's more out of fashion now. People claiming that maybe he's making poorer decisions as he gets older, doing some random things. And you have some of these teams where someone is so successful that maybe the guardrails aren't in place. Maybe the person's humility has sort of gone out the window to an extent. But the reason that those Patriots teams were so successful for 2 decades, Tom Brady, and then also the defenses that you have constructed by Belichick. And one of the things that was always so interesting over a huge sample is that you have the Patriots ranking far worse in yards allowed than points allowed. And one of the things that you see when you look at that is that anytime that these teams have big gaps in yards and points, there's a fluky element and you expect that to regress, and the teams that are giving up a lot of yards start giving up points. Except if the reason that you're giving up yards is a little bit different. If you're giving up yards because you can't stop big plays and those big plays are turning into scores, then you're going to have those things very highly correlated. If you're giving up a lot of yards because the main thing that you don't want to do is give up big plays, and you want to draw these drives out and give yourself as many chances to make an individual stop or for the opponent to make a mistake as possible, then you're going to give up more yards than you give up points, which is now what everyone wants to do. So I think that part of it is interesting. And then as soon as you get into an environment like you've discussed, where the rules maybe favor the passing game, you have a season like the pandemic where crowds can't mitigate the impact of one of the two quarterbacks every week, and you see that portion of it blow up, then defenses have to adjust. Defenses have to approach football in a way that will actually work. And then you see, even if it's somewhat subtle, and I think it is still pretty subtle, I think we're still in the very early days of analytics having a big impact on actual NFL games. But as you start to get analysts embedded in there with the front office and the coaching staff, and you get more of these arguments about the optimal way to play, it's going to be like other sports where you have to begin to chase that, or else you simply lose. And running plays are so much less valuable than passing plays. No one's really disputing that. You force a team to move the ball through as many running plays as possible, or passing plays that start to reflect some of the dynamics of running plays, where you don't gain a lot of yards, but you also then have the downside of a potential sack, which is going to dramatically decrease your chances of having a successful drive at that point. Now you started to move passing plays a little bit more into the realm of running plays in terms of the trade-offs. The flip side, or just the thing that teams have always had to try and force themselves to get away from, is this idea of imposing your will and having the macho element of a physical sport like football to be something that you build around. You mentioned those old Tampa cover 2 teams, and I mean, there are some things that they would do that maybe some X's and O people would argue were a little more passive, but those were still impose your will types of defenses. And when you look at how they performed under multiple coaches, I mean, they go out there and shut the offense down. This wasn't the thing of they're going to force you to a death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, they would beat you on the defensive side. We no longer have that in quite the same way. And again, it's by design, because the trade-offs and the incentives force it that way. But as you were going through all these different trends, it was so interesting to me. I've had a lot of fun in the last 24 hours looking through the RotoViz Advanced Team Explorer, which breaks down a crazy number of different team stats. You look at different things like total points and breaking them through all of the individual players. You have that as well in the Advanced Player Explorer. But when we're looking at things like expected points added per attempt, you can look at that on the pass side. You can look at that on the rush side. You mentioned this decline, and it's very striking when you look at 2019 and 2020 versus 2021 and 2022 to see the EPA per attempt plummet for teams in the passing game. 2021 was a huge low point, but really the only in terms of teams having elite numbers, not necessarily looking at the whole group, but teams who were excelling in that area, the only team kind of in this time span that has been able to really hold pat would be the Kansas City Chiefs, a team that is up there still in that over 0.2 EPA per attempt range that no one else can really manage. And that's despite the fact that the individual per play profile there in terms of how they're attacking is very different when you look at the air yards per attempt numbers for Mahomes and those plummeting. So the Chiefs have been able to counterattack and game plan for it when you have Mahomes, when you have Andy Reid. So probably the best quarterback and probably the best offensive mind in football together. Then you have a solution. But for everybody else, it's incredibly difficult. Now, the other thing that we can still look at, though, and think about what are the incentives for teams on the offensive side and how they want to attack going forward and how they should build their teams versus the incentives on the defense. And like, what point would that flip? When we're looking at the top teams in rushing EPA, we're looking at teams like the Eagles, Bears, Giants, Chiefs, but obviously on low volume, Browns, Ravens, Bills, Raiders, Falcons, Steelers. So one of the things that really jumps out there is you have a lot of influence from teams like the Bears, the Giants, the Browns, the Raiders, the Falcons, teams that you're not going to want to emulate from an offensive perspective. Whereas when you look on the passing side, you're talking about the teams that are in the mix to win the Super Bowl. So you have the Chiefs, the Bills, the Lions, which is an interesting little note, I think, when we think about what the Lions could do this year as they take the next step. One of the reasons why the Lions are a trendy team to win the AFC North and maybe even contest there. But then the 49ers, the Eagles, the Bengals, and the Jaguars. Then you have the Dolphins, where obviously you have the Tua injury situation. But when you're looking at the top teams in passing EPA per attempt, you're talking about the Super Bowl contenders. So if we have on the one side teams that are Super Bowl contenders and the other side teams that are competing for the number one overall pick, you get a sense of what defenses want you to do and what they'll continue to want you to do, even when you get very good efficiency from teams like the Bears and the Falcons. Unless you have the flip side of it, where, again, you have some teams like the Bills and the Chiefs actually who run the ball almost never. But when they do run the ball, because of the defenses they're facing, they're relatively efficient. But the teams that are built on both volume and efficiency in the run game, those are teams that are still extremely unsuccessful. That, I think, gives us a pretty strong signal in terms of what defenses will continue to try and do and what offenses have to do if they want to put their team in the mix to be a contender for the championship games. We think about, how do you want to build your roster to win Super Bowls? I mean, the number one thing you have to do is put it in the mix. You need to get in that Final Four, and you need to get in that Final Four somewhat frequently. The Chiefs have been able to do that, and as a result, they also got a couple of Super Bowls. A little bit of that is going to be luck, but the more times that you're there, the more often that the luck can kind of bounce in your favor. The Eagles team is really cool and really unique, and you're going to see teams try and build following that template as well. But we certainly see a path that is through quarterbacks like Mahomes, Burrow, maybe Lawrence coming up, Josh Allen, who's a little bit more of a unicorn. But when you look at that group together, I think that part of it is fascinating when you think about what actually works and what actually wins games.
And your point about the Fields type offense, I mean, this is a really easy way to tie all of this back into fantasy football. The Eagles ran 1,124 plays last year. You have a 17th game. It used to be just above 1,000 was the average for an NFL season. Now you can get up over 1,100 with some ease. They were fifth in the league. I mean, it's not like getting up over 1,100 is easy. It's about 60 plays per game, a little bit more than 60 plays on average. So adding that extra game has bumped almost every team up about 60 plays. The league average last year, 1,066 plays. Point is, it's right around 1,000, 1,100 plays, what have you. Jalen Hurts, just on design runs, not including scrambles, had 123 designed runs. That's more than 10% of their offensive plays. They had 1,124 plays, 123 design runs. Hurts had more rushing attempts. That's not designed. It's designed plus scrambles, but a lot of them were designed. More rushing attempts inside the 10-yard line than he had passing attempts. That's the way that they ran their offense in close. In particular, we know smart analytics offenses will favor the run when they get inside the 10-yard line. That's going to impact their touchdown rate, right? Like, that's why they had 32 rushing touchdowns last year, I think it was. Easily led the league in rushing TDs. That's something that is a concern for me on guys like A.J. Brown's price. He's got to catch a really high percentage of their touchdowns because they don't throw inside the 10-yard line a lot. They could change, but you're talking about offenses emulating that, and I think there are going to be offenses that emulate that. Hurts was way out in design runs. Fields was second, though, with 89, and one of the big stories was the middle of the year, they finally started using him on design runs. About 7-8 weeks into the season, they had not used Justin Fields on a lot of design runs, and suddenly it was that Patriots game, they started to do it more, and from that point on, that's when he got dynamic, was when they actually allowed his design rushing to be a weapon in their offense. We've talked about this on the show. It was a big part of the Giants offense, the ways that they at least showed Daniel Jones' rushing ability and used it scheming. They schemed with it effectively. It was a big part of what made Atlanta vaguely decent. But as you point to, that these offenses weren't the most successful offenses in the league, but it was a way for bad teams to be functional is really what it comes down to. Use the quarterback's rushing ability, etc. The Eagles, sort of the stark counterexample of that, where they used Hurts design runs in the areas of the field that mattered the most, and they also used it just so effectively along with the rushing attack that the running backs were very effective too, and their offense was still very explosive. It all went together very, very well in Philadelphia. But when we think about it from the fantasy perspective, these types of offenses, I'm talking about just the design runs. Fields, again, was at 89 and could have, had he had been getting design runs all year, the point I was trying to make, could have easily been up over 100. Lamar Jackson was also right in that range of Fields. I don't have his number in front of me, but another guy who missed some time would have likely been over 100 design carries. You're talking about 10% of the team's offense. When I was talking about 150 plus carries for a quarterback, that includes the scrambles. In those types of offenses and those types of situations, 150 carries, you're starting to get towards, 15% of the play volume for a team in a season. That is just, the ball doesn't leave the quarterback's hand, right? So we talk about this with quarterback rushing, but there's no rush attempt, there's no reception, there's no target. Anytime there's a quarterback rush, the skill players in fantasy don't get any stats. They get a block. They don't get to do anything else that matters for us in fantasy. And so these types of offenses are obviously losing some volume in terms of what's actually there for them and how that all shakes out. And the range of outcomes and all of those things. When you have an offense with a lot of quarterback rushes, you have a different range of potential plays that can go to the skill players. When you get into the Bears and Falcons range of total play volume last year, and the reason you can get so low is any runs keep the clock running and lead to fewer plays, typically. A run rate, higher run rate, this is why we talk about pass rate over expected a lot, Shawn. More passes, more incompletions, more opportunities to stop the clock, typically more overall play volume. It's also more efficient, and so you wind up with higher scoring games, also stops the clock, and possessions can be quicker, things of that nature. More running, you can have 8-minute drives that just waste half a quarter, and it's we're just letting 40 seconds run off the clock every play. You can have the way low end of play volume, which is where the Bears and Falcons were at last year. And then you also talk about this tax. I wrote about it in season last year. It's calling it a tax on skill position volume, a 10% or 20% tax on skill position volume. On the flip side, if there is still an offense, you can have a rushing quarterback offense that still plays fast. The Eagles were the second highest in the NFL in neutral no huddle rate last year. That's one of the reasons they were able to still get off a lot of plays, even though they were running so much. You can have, but there's still play volume concerns, right? There's still a maximum. You can't be top 5. Maybe it's not play volume concerns. I just mentioned they were 5th in play volume, but it's pass volume concerns is what I'm trying to get at. You can't be top 5 in pass volume. The Eagles were 23rd in pass volume, even though they were 5th in plays and pass attempts. And so when you're that low in pass attempts, you have to have a very concentrated passing target tree, which they did last year, incredibly concentrated, in fact. They only had 4 wide receivers get a target all season. It's a big reason why A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith still got plenty, even though there wasn't a lot of passes to go around. But the point there is, how much more can they get? Where's the maximum when the quarterback is running as much as they are? And you also think about the ways that the offenses are going to evolve in 2023. We did a whole bunch of history here. But one of the other things I'm going to completely butcher, X's and O's people who know football better than me, that played high school football, whatever, are going to tell me that I'm wrong about, is the ways that the formations impact, the substituting and everything impacts the play calling. So again, I'm going to go back to a Seahawks game. The Patriots Super Bowl, where they threw an interception at the line of scrimmage, and the big discussion about that was, we had a 3 wide receiver package out there. They were hurrying up to the offense. They didn't want to use the timeout, or they weren't necessarily hurrying up, but they didn't want to use a timeout. Had a running clock. They had a 3 receiver package out there. The Patriots put in additional defensive linemen. It was a run-heavy defensive front at the line of scrimmage. And the ways that the Seahawks justified that decision of not calling Marshawn Lynch's number in that Super Bowl was, when you're in that situation, 10 times out of 10, maybe, you have the advantage to throw, basically. You have additional receivers on the field. You don't have enough blockers to handle their extra defensive tackles that they've brought in. They're basically playing a goal line defensive front against a standard 3-wide passing formation that the Seahawks are playing. And when those are the numbers in the huddles, which coaches are looking at this stuff when the substitutions are happening. All right, they're in a strong formation defensively. We're in an 11 formation. We don't have extra tight ends on the field, nothing. We're in 11 formation, 3-wide formation offensively. You call a pass play. That's a pass look that the defense has shown you. Obviously, I still think they should have ran with Marshawn Lynch, but this is the point. This is how they defended that. That's how NFL coaches think. In today's modern NFL, the issue of all the extra defensive backs in the defensive huddle that I was talking about is one that I think offenses are trying to go at that. I think we're going to see an increase in 2 tight end formations. We saw the Chiefs do it some. Even though they're a heavy passing team, they love to use that package with Jody Fortson and Noah Gray on the field last year. I think it's the reason the Bills drafted Dalton Kincaid in the first round, and they've talked him up as like their Cole Beasley replacement as their slot receiver. They're going to use him and Knox together, put 2 tight ends on the field, see what the defense does. If they stay in their light formation, they can put those 2 tight ends on the line of scrimmage, and now you have a power formation with 2 blocking tight ends, and you can run with Damian Harris and Latavius Murray. I also think it's why they brought in those heavy rushing running backs, those 2 tight end runners, those types of power runners. Damian Harris and Latavius Murray both kind of fit that mold to me. I don't think the Bills are going to do that every down this year. I do think we're going to see a little bit more of that until they get teams to take a defensive back off the field and put a linebacker on the field, at which case then they can break the huddle and split Dalton Kincaid out, and they can throw the ball out of a 2 tight end formation where they're treating Kincaid like a wide receiver. I think it's the same reason the Giants signed Darren Waller as their big ad. I think it was very smart of Brian Daboll. He still likes Daniel Bellinger. I don't think they just hate Daniel Bellinger. I think they can play both of them at the same time, and they can split Waller out, or they can bring him in line and they can have 2 tight ends and they can run against lighter fronts and lock in this rushing advantage. I think it's something that the Patriots are thinking about when they bring in Gesicki, even though Gesicki doesn't go in line a lot. Still, you have the availability of having 2 tight ends in the formation and either forcing the defense to take a defensive back off the field, or if they don't, to then have even more of a rushing advantage, I think is sort of the idea that I would argue. But there's ways that teams are going to combat this. And one of the points that you were sort of just making as well, Sean, is they need to just throw into the nickel and dime formation sometimes, right? Even though it's telling you that's a run front, they need to be willing to still throw. That is something we saw in some offenses last year. One of the craziest things about the 2022 NFL season, when we talk about macro trends, you can go all the way back to the 1982 NFL season. That was a strike-shortened season. There was only 9 games, so we have some weird data. And beyond 1982 and earlier, you go into the 70s, totally different sport. It was a different sport in the 80s and the 90s too, but you can go all the way back to 1982, that strike-shortened season, basically 40 years of football, right? The Bears last year were the second lowest in pass attempts per game in that span. Only the 1990 Los Angeles Raiders were lower. The Bucs were the second highest. Only I think it's 2009 Detroit Lions, Matthew Stafford Detroit Lions, Calvin Johnson Detroit Lions were higher. In the same NFL season, over a 40-year span, we're talking about 30 teams every year, basically. You're talking about, 1,000 data points here. We had the second highest and the second lowest in the same season. We also had the Falcons as one of the bottom 5. And we had the Chargers as I don't think the Falcons were bottom 5 because there's some teams in the 80s and 90s that ran a lot fewer pass attempts. But Falcons were very low as well, especially for the last decade or so, since passing has been more familiar in the NFL. The Chargers were way up there with the Bucs as well last year. Point being, we had a wide range of how these teams approach these defenses, which is another data point, Sean, about D's are running what they want to run. They're just worried about stopping explosives. You're not going to get them to take that defensive back off the field, right, easily anymore. They're going to just stay in their defensive formation that's a lighter front, and they're going to force you to run the ball and matriculate the ball down the field or throw underneath. And then there's offenses that are attacking that different ways. On the really extreme low pass attempt side, that was the teams that were willing to just run. Okay, give us a light front. That's a run box. I'm going to keep running into that. The guys on the heavy pass attempt front also had ADOT issues, right? Tom Brady, we talked about this a lot last year. was throwing underneath an absolute ton. That's why he had so many pass attempts. It's basically just a run game or pass game as an extension of a run game. Same idea. They weren't really attacking. And that was the issue with the Chargers offense as well, right? Way too low of an ADOT. They threw an absolute ton, but they were throwing underneath. It was basically just checkdowns to Austin Eckler and everyone else that was racking up that total to such an astronomical level. But the point is, if the defenses stay in these formations, they stay in the nickels and the dimes, and they're asking the offense to make decisions, you have to think through in fantasy football what the head coach of these teams are going to do. Like I want to be on Kyle Pitts, but like I'm still concerned that Arthur Smith really likes to run the football like a little bit too much, right? But that is the team with Desmond Ridder. You look at the splits with Ridder late in the year, some of the other things about just sort of the way their season went. I am a little bit optimistic about their regression, but you start thinking about some of the concerns about the mobility issues where you have this big tax on skill position plays in some offenses, like with the Bears again, for example. I know there's a lot of people optimistic, better offensive line. They're going to call more pass plays. All of those things are true. But again, this was fewer pass attempts per game than any team except one in 40 seasons at the NFL level. You're talking about a Justin Fields offense that, I mean, he's going to have to get the ball out quicker, which he will. They're going to have to call more pass plays, which they will. Their offensive line is going to have to be a lot better so we can turn more of these pass attempts or dropbacks into actual pass attempts, which will happen. But all of those things have to regress substantially for them to even get to like league average. It's at some point, the range of outcomes for an offense like that is more challenging. And then the question is, does the coaching staff want to have Justin Fields drop back and throw into pass looks, or are they going to continue to call run plays at a decent clip in those situations? How far does it regress, right? Like, I do think they're going to throw more. And I've had a lot of people mention, yeah, they have a better offensive line. Yes. But like his sack rate was astronomical. His scramble rate was astronomical. Those things are going to regress. I don't think they're going to be the craziest thing in the world, but like how much are they going to regress? Because they have to regress a ton. And when you start thinking about the ways that they're actually going to call plays on 3rd and 3, are they going to drop him back on 3rd and 3 and have him throw against 5 DBs? I think they're going to run the ball, right? They're going to use his mobility as a threat, and they might hand off. They might have him run a keeper. That changes the way that this offense, assuming defenses continue to play them the same way. But like one of the conversations is, oh, well, if they're running so effectively, then the defense will have to get back out of the cover 2 shells, play single high, move guys down in the box. The problem is we didn't see that as much in 2022. I don't have the data behind it. So, yeah.
Before we get too far into that, I want to make a couple of quick notes here that I think are pretty interesting in terms of what the teams are likely to do. And we've talked a lot about the Bears and the Falcons. You can also extend that to other teams. And one of the reasons that I feel like defenses are more willing to play passively is that other defenses are also more willing to play passively. And what I mean by that is that in the old days, one of the things that was really important is that you either control time of possession or you stay competitive, right? You don't want the opponent to run a ton more plays than you run yourself, because you're going to have issues with conditioning and all of that sort of thing. But if your opponent is approaching it the same way and they're also letting you run the ball a lot, then you end up getting that balance. And as a result, you get fewer possessions. But both teams are approaching it from a similar perspective. So you don't have to worry the other team is going to have the ball the entire game, right? One of the things that's kind of interesting about the Bears and the Falcons running effectively last year is that they also stopped the run ineffectively. And so their games could have a lot of running plays in a relatively limited number of total plays because both teams are just running the ball and letting each other run it. I think that we're going to have a little bit of bounce back on the team specific level with that. And yet at the same time, from a broad perspective, as long as both teams are approaching it the same way, you don't have that risk that within any given game, you're going to get wiped out from this total play perspective, or you don't have the same risk. You always have those things that could pop up if the opponent successfully executes a number of 14, 15, 16, 17 play drives, which is something that we did see last season. But the note that you made there was something that really jumped out to me in looking again through the Advanced Stat Explorer. Justin Fields, you mentioned the sacks. I mean, his pressure percentage led the NFL 41%. Sacks percentage also led the NFL 12% off of that. You look at the other guys who were up there at the top of the leaderboard in pressure percentage. You have guys like Daniel Jones. You have terrible players like Zach Wilson, right? But then you have guys like Deshaun Watson. You have a Russell Wilson. You have Ryan Tannehill. These types of players who are the scramble guys. And you look at the sack percentages at the top there, Deshaun Watson, and you could argue that a little bit of that is coming in cold, but Russell Wilson, Daniel Jones is up there. So when you're talking about the scramble QBs and how they can help the running game and the efficiency of the running game and even converting some of these third downs, they have that flip side issue that they can be sacked. And so if a team is running the ball successfully on you, but sacks are also going to creep up when they are forced to pass, again, that's perfect. They're doing exactly what you want to do there. You have very different incentives when you're facing a team like the Eagles. And the other note that you had about the team volume there is that when we're thinking about the profile of a team in terms of pass versus run, we also have to think of the profile in terms of quality versus targeting the number one pick in next year's draft. If you are a bad team like the Bears and the Falcons, you want there to be as few plays per game as possible. If you're the Eagles, you want there to be more. So even if you're a run-heavy team like they are, then you respond to that with what they did, which is to run the ball a lot, but also be very fast in terms of time to snap, all of those kinds of things that get you more plays so you have more opportunities to expand your gap over the opponent. So when we're looking at teams like the Bears and the Falcons, one of the questions we really have to answer, or at least consider, is have they made the adjustments in terms of overall quality that might change how they play? I think it's more a matter of how good they're going to be than will they change their mindset, because the quality almost has to come first. The quality has to be the catalyst. You look at the Bears side, they add DJ Moore. You look at the Falcons side, they've moved from, as I mentioned on a recent show, I feel like the thing I really got wrong about 2022 was just how bad Marcus Mariota was going to be. Now, you can argue that Desmond Ridder may not be enough of a step forward, but if you have a maturing offense with Pitts and with London being in his second year, obviously you need Pitts to be healthier. Then you have Bijan. Have these teams improved enough to be incentivized to want there to be more plays?
That's a really good point. That's the first sort of, I think, counterpoint to this that acknowledges the trends actually exist, that makes me vaguely intrigued by, like, Chicago, for example. The quality does have to come first, and that's a really good point. I'm trying to think of other run quarterback heavy teams where, they've had some quality but not been super fast. There's not a lot coming to mind. There are some that haven't necessarily had the quality on a team level, but have still run enough plays because they're willing to play fast. The Cardinals immediately come to mind. Most of Kyler's career, they've at least played pretty fast, despite not necessarily being particularly high quality offense.
Which is why you see a regime change there.
Right. Absolutely. But yeah, I guess that's the bull case for the Bears. But again, you start talking about the scrambles plus the sacks. I've used this number before. 28% of Justin Fields' dropbacks last year did not end in a pass attempt. They ended in either a sack or a scramble. I do think he'll get rid of the ball sooner this year on like a time to throw basis. He'll become a little bit of a better processor. It might be something that is limiting for him long term, but I do think it starts to develop. It's certainly not like a huge strength. But that's sort of the question with Fields is, can he process well enough? Because everything else is there, right? He has the athleticism. He has the arm strength and arm talent and accuracy. He delivers the ball away from leverage. He has a great feel for where the defenders are when he throws the ball. He's always throwing sort of to the right spot. Huge Fields fan. I think longtime Stealing Bananas listeners know that. I spent the whole 2021 season defending him the entire regular season. It was a bit by the end of the year that I needed to go one episode without getting into a 10-minute defense of Justin Fields. But the concern is, okay, can he process well enough that for fantasy? I still think Fields is going to take a step forward and have a great year. My concern for fantasy, for DJ Moore, for the passing game, can he take enough of a step forward as a processor with probably a little bit of a better offensive line, which is expected, that he's turning I mean, that 28% of his dropbacks that are not becoming pass attempts because he's holding the ball too long, they're becoming either scrambles or sacks. Some of that's not being holding the ball too long. It's the high pressure rate that you mentioned. So the pressure rate comes down. He becomes a better processor. He has receivers that are getting open quicker. They run more RPOs that are quick pass decisions. They do all of these things to turn that exact number, more of the dropbacks, into pass attempts. But does that 28% get down to 20%? Does it get down to 15%? How many of the dropbacks are still not becoming pass attempts? That's the big question for me. But I mean, you make a good point about, do they start to play faster if they're playing better? Part of my thing is I go back and look at their game log. When they actually had some up-tempo games last year, they had some of those wild games. That's when Fields was scrambling more. That's how, when they started playing that way, he was taking off and running more. It wasn't great for the skill position guys. It was great for field stats, but it wasn't, and so DJ Moore will improve that from a receiver perspective because, he should be a big part about what they want to do underneath. Particularly, I think that's a big part of it, being able to get open underneath quicker developing routes, because I think part of the issue last year, you had Mooney and then Claypool coming over mid-season. They're both higher ADOT guys who's, they're running downfield routes, trying to get open downfield. Fields didn't have enough time with the pressure rate, et cetera. So if Moore can win on slants and just be open, he could rack up a massive target share because they need somebody to be able to let Fields get the ball out quickly on some plays. And Moore's good at those things. Sorry, go ahead.
He is. And I also wanted to mention this idea of the rush offense being really dynamic and how that can force the defense out of what they want to do. I guess I'm a little skeptical about this, and just looking at one team isn't going to answer the question in any way, shape, or form. But you look at the Chicago Bears, one of these teams that is definitely a focal point, and they ran the ball very effectively from an EPA per attempt perspective over the first 9 weeks of last season. From that point on, their rushing efficiency declined. Some of it probably just natural regression. Some of it defenses maybe adjusting to what they are doing. But the defenses adjusting to what they're doing did not in any way, shape, or form help the offense from a passing perspective, because they were far worse in the second half of the season than the first. And that's a little bit hard for me to completely conceptualize when obviously Fields was terrible over that first month. And yet, one of the things that you think about too is once Darnell Mooney is injured, they have absolutely nothing in the passing game. I do think that the guys that they've added are going to make a big difference there. But I guess I have some skepticism about how you can force teams to play this differently. You look at some of the teams who are the most dynamic in the run game, and you're going to see teams with the mobile quarterbacks, and you're going to see teams with the great runners. So again, you pull up the Advanced Team Stat Explorer, and one of the things that you see both in terms of efficiency and in terms of boom plays. So this is kind of a cool note. The boom percentage is going to give you EPA plays that added a full point, right? The boom plays, even after all of the changes, are still obviously much, much higher in the passing game than they are in the running game. All you have to do is just very quickly glance over the average yards per attempt in both areas to know that that's going to be the case. But when you see it, it really reinforces it again. If you want to stop teams from changing their drive or scoring instantly, you have to stop the boom plays in the passing game. And so you think about some of those teams, a Jonathan Taylor elite season, a Nick Chubb elite season, a Derrick Henry elite season. For any of those seasons to be scary, you can go back to Adrian Peterson. For any of those seasons to be scary, it has to be accompanied by some dynamism in the passing game. You think about Henry, when the Titans actually succeeded, it was because Ryan Tannehill's efficiency numbers were fantastic, right? It wasn't predicated purely on Henry, even if in that case, maybe he did force defenses to change. I think that part of it is interesting. But you look at some of the other elements here, and there's nothing about what Taylor and Chubb are doing that is going to make you come down and try and stuff them. If anything, your incentive is to keep them in front of you, as opposed to let them rumble for 60, 70 yards and score on the one play. And so I think that defenses are going to make another level of adjustment, add another wrinkle I don't know specifically what it'll be. I don't know that we'll know ahead of time. One of the things that I think is also a little bit true here is that it doesn't actually take 32 elite defensive coordinators. In discussions with people about the competency of NFL coordinators, I'm not in any way trying to impugn their ability to do things, but you're going to have a range. You're not going to have everybody operating at this top level. But we do know that there are innovative schemers on both sides of the ball that create plays and schemes and adjustments that everyone then copies. And you can think of a little bit of what happened to the Dolphins last season. Now, some of what happened with the Dolphins passing game and taking away the middle is going to be kind of inextricably tied up with the injuries to Tua. And we didn't necessarily get to see the full adjustments that Miami might have made to that. But it's not so much a matter of, okay, you've got to completely shut down the passing game. You've got to take Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle away, as we're going to take away a certain type of play and make it harder for them to be efficient. The incentive for NFL defenses is going to continue to force quarterbacks to repeatedly execute short yardage throws, which means that if you're struggling to stop a team running the ball, you shift the scheme in such a way that you're giving up the soft passes. You don't shift the scheme in a way that gives up the vertical passes, because we know that teams like Chicago with a Justin Fields, in all likelihood an Indianapolis Colts with Anthony Richardson, where if there's an area he excels as a passer, it's this incredible arm strength and the ability to make these throws over the top that almost no one can make. It's very clear cut for defenses that you want Fields to have to repeatedly complete passes, that you want Richardson to have to repeatedly complete passes. You think about Lamar Jackson. What do you want him to do? You want him to have to repeatedly complete passes. They're not going to let you throw over the top. There are things that they can do to accomplish that are more complicated than just, okay, we're going to put more people on the defensive line or right by the line of scrimmage in a way that compromises our ability to stop the deep pass.
And they don't want those guys to run a ton necessarily, but if they're dropping back and saying, we're not going to give you the deep pass, we're going to make you go through your progressions, it might end up leading to more scrambles, but more scrambles where, again, you have a lot of DBs on the field, down the field in a zone. The quarterbacks tend to have really big rushing plays against man coverage where you get, a lot of downfield routes and the defenders are running, and that's been talked about a lot. Lamar Jackson, for example, I know has really good rushing numbers against man coverage specifically. You have to try to put a spy on him. He's probably going to make the spy miss. But when you're in a zone, there's ways that, anyway, they might actually want them to run a little bit more or scramble a little bit more, just because, like, how many times, eventually the quarterback's going to get tired is another part of it. But
Justin Fields got the old Jerick McKinnon treatment in week 18 last year. He was benched for dead legs.
Yeah. One of the things, as you were going through that, you're talking about the Dolphins. That's a really intriguing one I'm not going to go into. But you're talking about a lot of specific teams. And that's one of the really big points here, as I was trying to emphasize, with the really low pass volume, really high pass volume differences between, like, the Bears and the Bucs last season. Different teams are doing different stuff, right? And that's, like, the league is evolving. And this is the whole point I kind of wanted to get into on this entire podcast. Like, we finally got to where, like, I knew I would get there talking with you, Shawn, because you helped me so much with this kind of stuff. But the thing that's been frustrating me is the analysis I'm seeing around the fantasy industry that assumes that every player and every offense is the same, and we can just analyze the two different profiles next to each other. And even though, as I said at the top, like, we can't be sure about what offenses are. It's one of the biggest lessons we've had in fantasy is, like, sometimes offenses get way better, get way worse. They change a lot. I still think it's a huge mistake in 2023 to be analyzing each individual player next to each other. Like, oh, I like this wide receiver profile versus that wide receiver profile. I love Drake London's wide receiver profile. I have not been able to pull the trigger on him at his cost for various reasons. I'm actually, again, for the second time, less concerned about Atlanta because they are going away from Mariota to Ritter, who likely will run less. Their rate of of designed runs per drop back completely cratered when they changed their quarterback last year. Ritter only had the 4 starts, small sample, but a way lower rate of designed runs. So there's some optimism in Atlanta that it's not as much of a mobile QB thing. But different teams are doing different stuff. I'm getting into specifics in Atlanta now, right? One of the big reasons this is happening is analytics departments are actually more involved now in some of this stuff. That's one of the things that's been talked about over 5 years, 10 years, over this last decade, right? When we talk about the defensive changes, one of the things that analytics was really pushing, analytics in air quotes, right? Just evidence-based thinking was pushing for the last decade was the passing game is more efficient than the running game. Well, eventually it makes sense that smart people in these organizations would say, well, that is the same on either side of the ball. On defense, we should try harder to stop the passing game than we should try to stop the running game, which is essentially what you and I talked a lot about in season last year, what the defenses did. And it really made offensive play more difficult last season. It made football a little bit more boring, frankly, last football season. Again, this is the thing I want to emphasize. We can't just pretend like this 2022 season didn't happen. Another thing you hit on there, young coaches, something that the Fantasy Douche wrote about years ago, right? But we finally had that wave come in. Sean McVay and all of these guys, great series over at The Athletic with the Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan, Matt LaFleur, Mike McDaniel quartet being interviewed a whole bunch and talking about their time together early in their career and how they've all expanded to be head coaches now. But also on the defensive side, young coaches that are trying things. They're trying new things, right? You talked about it's a copycat league, but Mike McDaniel came up with stuff. People might copycat Mike McDaniel. We might see some offenses try to implement that around the league. Brandon Staley is, I think, widely regarded as the one who came up with on the defensive side, a younger guy, came up with the answer to, the Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen. And vertical passing was exploding in 2020. I mean, we had even more downfield passing than ever. He came up with these cover 2 deep shells. And however defenses are playing it this year, it's probably a little different than the Tampa 2 years, a little different than other, cover 2s. There's variations that are complicated. Offenses have to come up with answers. But young coaches coming up with new plans. Things are going to keep changing, though, as young coaches come up with – that's what, you were emphasizing. As young coaches continue to come up with answers, we're talking about what happened last year. I don't know necessarily what's going to happen going into 2023, but it's important to consider. It's important to consider for a variety of reasons, but being ahead of these changes is going to help lead to success in fantasy football. When we're talking about different teams, one of the questions I've been asked about the most with different opinions I've given this offseason about different players, it always seems to be like, I don't understand, Ben, why you are down on this player but high on this player, and look at these two players next to each other and some of the stats that you reference, Ben, what gives? And in almost all the situations, I'm like, look at the offenses that they're in. I think their ranges are just very different. I like the range of probability bet on this side for what this offense could be. So if I could sum up high-level bullet points, how to play all of this discussion in fantasy football, the first thing is skill players in rushing QB offenses, they have just a different range of outcomes for what the volume can be there. There can be enough, but there can be not enough, right? And there can't be top 5, typically, pass attempts or those types of things. Number 2 thing I would say is that we didn't get a ton into this, but like deep threats, I just don't think generally we're getting as many deep shots with these cover 2 shells. Like I think it was it's that old thought that deep threats are good best ball plays. I think that is more or less the case. Like they're fine for best ball, but there's going to be weekly inconsistency. We saw some of the better deep threats in the league last year have some games where they're just not involved. And it's tough to consistently win downfield against teams that are playing more secondary players, and they're trying to take that away. That's what they're, if that's your role in your offense, you're now just running off safeties for underneath pass attempts. Conversely, one of the things I keep hearing about the Chargers is they got Kellen Moore. Justin Herbert's ADOT's going to rise. And yeah, I do think it's going to rise because it was a significant career low last year. I'm going to pull up his ADOTs for his 3 seasons. 7.8, 7.9 his first 2 seasons, was down to 6.9 last year. Yes, it's going to rise, but I've had people tell me that it's going to be a career high. It's going to go over the 7.8, 7.9 in 2020 and 2021. I have a hard time understanding why it would in the 2023 defensive atmosphere, because people are still not going to just let Justin Herbert throw over top of them. They're going to put safeties back there. So, one of those things, like I still love the Chargers offense, but important to think about. So one of the reasons I'm really high on Keenan Allen, less so on Mike Williams' breakout potentials, because Mike Williams would have to somehow beat double coverage constantly because he's more of the downfield runner.
The other thing, just like kind of on how the offense works, is that Austin Eckler is a fantastic receiver. He's not a great pure runner. They don't have other runners who can really go in and do anything. And so it doesn't necessarily matter that much how you do the accounting. But as long as Austin Eckler is heavily involved as a receiving back, you're going to have a lot of very short yardage passes that are going to affect the average. The other thing is, if you think that Justin Herbert is going to throw over the top this year, you need a lot of exposure to Quentin Johnston.
I like that call. The last thing I was going to say is I was taking some notes as you were talking in your last one of these things that are maybe things to consider, maybe not even big draft impacts, but things to consider on the waiver wire, etc. The last thing I want to throw out there is the possibility for multiple tight ends in one offense being somewhat viable. Just something to bookmark. It's probably for most people in managed leagues more about the waiver wire in season, but I think we still as an industry this year are way too afraid of teams that have two different tight ends that are listed as two different tight ends, drafting them both. We talked about it on the show, Sean, about the New England tight ends. I think Dawson Knox is undervalued as a result of some of this stuff.
One very low-level one would be Trey McBride, who seems to be continued to be pulled down by Zach Ertz. And I don't know what the deal is with Zach Ertz, who, from what little coverage you get out of Arizona, sounds like he's not healthy right now, although he should be ready for week 1. But if you like either of those guys individually, I mean, you don't have to look at the wide receiver depth chart too hard to know that those guys could get targets.
That's another great one. So especially, like I said, that's one more for in season. But if you're in week 2, remember this conversation that like there's going to be some offenses that don't use the tight end enough, which we know, like the Bengals. They have Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Like Irv Smith is going to run a lot of routes. He might have some spike weeks, whatever, but he's not going to probably be much different than what C.J. Uzomah and Hayden Hurst were the last couple of years in Cincinnati, because you're not going to steal targets from Jamar Chase when you're Irv Smith. It's just not going to happen. And there's going to be other offenses where, you know, the number 2 tight end, quote unquote, number 2 tight end, it's going to feel a little bit like our conversations the last few years, Sean, where we've said you don't have to name a number 1 wide receiver on some of these offenses. You don't have to call somebody the number 1 and somebody the number 2. The quote unquote number 2 tight end might actually be fantasy viable in some of these offenses. Another low key one is the Ravens. There's talk that they might spread things out more. We might see Isaiah. I don't think probably there's enough for Isaiah Likely because they've added so much at wide receiver, but we might see it Likely and Andrews on the field together sometimes, and it might be start to get interesting for Isaiah Likely. But anyway, there's at least the possibility for this multiple tight end thing that I do think teams are going to show in the huddle to get the defense to match substitutionally and then try to use that to their advantage.
One other note I wanted to ask you about kind of as we wrap up here is it's not just about the rushing quarterbacks for me as we look at the pass volume. But if we are moving into an environment where passing EPA is dropping and rushing EPA is rising, even if they don't necessarily still meet in the middle, even if it's more efficient to pass, and again, for most teams, even if that's the path to being the dominant team, it worries me for teams that are bottom 10. Because one of the things you would always see in the past would be a handful of guys where you could rely on them for serious garbage time. And if you move into a 2023 environment where you can run the ball relatively effectively, even if your team is bad, and one of the reasons your team is bad is that you don't pass the ball very well. And then the opposing defense is also sort of leaning into that and saying, just run it at us. You'll never beat us this way. Then where do you get the garbage time production from? Where do you get these end of the QB window, maybe even beginning of the scrub range where you have some breakout outcomes that are almost purely volume based? Because when you look at the number of dropbacks last season, you look at the leaderboard there and you see Tom Brady and Justin Herbert at the top. Those teams underperformed, but they were teams that had Super Bowl aspirations when they started the season, and those teams are going to continue to go after it. You have Patrick Mahomes, Kirk Cousins, Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, Geno Smith, Trevor Lawrence. Those are all teams there are playoff teams that in the mix. You're not getting teams that are down by multiple touchdowns and suddenly are throwing caution to the wind, and you drive up the number of attempts in an environment where, a defense is going to let you score some because they're ahead enough and they don't care. Now they're just saying, do a 15-play drive that is mostly rushing, lose to us by 10 points instead of 17. You have no way to come back like that. And yet the incentive for the team that is terrible is to lose by smaller margins, to keep the owner a little bit happier and to say, okay, we're building for next year. That's the part that I think is just a little bit of a bummer when you think about, again, how fun football is on Sunday. When you're tuning in and you want to see some theatrics in the second half of these games, if teams are more or less capitulating and teams down by multiple touchdowns are running the ball and running the clock out on themselves, which we saw repeatedly last season, that creates, again, this dynamic where the quarterbacks really are separated by tier. You don't get league winners out of it, and you don't get their peripheral pieces pulled up because they're simply not attacking in situations where in past time periods, maybe those teams would have attacked.
We're over an hour, Sean. I've got very impassioned. I do want to say before we go, again, I don't think that I'm an expert on X's and O's and stuff. Honest to God, it's one of those things that makes you not want to go into a lot of the stuff I went into because I'm certain that I made mistakes at some point when I was running through some of the old, the history and this and that and whatever. I'm certain that I don't have all of it right. Most of this is just me piecing things together from years of being a football fan, right? Like watching the game and being interested in it and hearing things throughout and the references and the comments I'm making. And so, if somebody's listening, I don't know why we would have a Stealing Bananas listener who's an NFL coach, or a football coach. If somebody's listening and as a football coach at the high school level, even, I still don't think there's probably a lot of Stealing Bananas listeners that are football coaches at all, because why would they want to listen to us? We're not exactly their audience, or they're probably not our target audience. But if there is someone like that who was listening and saying, this guy is talking a lot about something that he doesn't quite understand the nuances of, I'm sorry. I apologize. Please let me know where I was wrong on that, because I would understand how that could be annoying. At the same time, I think it's worth me potentially being wrong to have, run through a lot of this stuff and at least try to highlight it, because I'm seeing, again, a lot of stuff around the industry that is seemingly completely disinterested in coming to terms with what the 2022 season actually was from a macro perspective, that rushing was at an all-time high efficiency-wise, that passing fell again, that the reasons for that, the ways that defenses played it. And you got to give me more than just, this player is this in some of these cases, where you have to explain to me, in particular, one of the things we see, Sean, is those really brief arguments that are, this player's done this much, and so he's going at this ADP, so he's obviously a good value. You have to at least address why the market would be valuing it that way. And in some cases, the market is skeptical of some of these teams that have these concerns. Like the Colts, for example. The Colts are going to be one of these types of offenses with the rushing quarterback stuff probably this year. And I think the market's pretty skeptical of a lot of their pass catchers and those types of things for good reason. So you have to give me, a reason that you are better than the market on it. I think also there's this, it's just, to me, the fantasy discussion on a team-by-team level especially is just far more interesting when it's a little bit in depth and we're actually acknowledging the ways that things are evolving right now. Because the NFL is fluid right now. The stuff with the analytics departments, the younger coaches, all that stuff. Teams are trying different things. There's a copycat league going on, but it's all getting sharper in real time. And again, you're not going to win in fantasy football, I don't think, by just ignoring that and looking strictly at the players.
And when you say looking at the players, you're talking about the player profiles in a vacuum without understanding the concentration of their offenses, the volume in the offenses, the quality of the quarterbacks. Quality for me continues to jump out. And as I'm looking at teams that could take the next step and be the next version of Kansas City, I mean, there are going to be a limited number of those teams. And so one of the teams I've found difficult to play this season is Jacksonville, because there's such massive uncertainty in Calvin Ridley, but then that trickles down to where it almost certainly shifts the outcomes for Christian Kirk. It damages dramatically the breakout that Zay Jones was showing at the beginning or at the end of last season. And it complicates matters for Evan Ingram, even though his upside scenario, I think, is quite compelling. And so we look at that both from a best ball perspective, a redraft perspective, a dynasty perspective. One of the little notes that I made for myself earlier when you were talking was this idea about where people now fit, and thinking about the rushing quarterbacks and thinking about some of those numbers with Deshaun Watson. And even if we expect him to get a lot better, one of the notes that I made in the article that I'll have coming out, either started as this podcast is releasing or just afterward, was about a dynasty startup that I'm doing currently. And I've got some sort of general notes in there about the QB position and how it might be looked at incorrectly in dynasty currently, that sort of anchor running back and superflex is the new version of what we always had with running back, where it's not nuanced enough to actually help you build a team. It's too simple of a rubric for thinking through how you want to get where you want to go. But the individual player that really jumped out for me with that was Deshaun Watson, who went at the 112 and is currently my 29th ranked player in Superflex. 29th is still high, right? But it's going to seem weird because you think about all of the trade value that ends up being exposed as you move through those rounds. One of the issues with Deshaun Watson is that we tend to think about his scoring and how he impacted fantasy football within the framework of the scoring a couple of years ago. And you put even some of his good seasons in today's environment, and it doesn't work the same way. If you haven't made that adjustment to understand where Deshaun Watson actually fits, it's a problem. Even though he does scramble some, even though he's a mobile quarterback, even though he has this vertical passing ability, are the things that Deshaun Watson does well going to be enough when you think about 2023, not 2019? Right? We're not there anymore. And so this has been a really fun offseason for me because ADP has shifted so dramatically, because we are still dealing with all of those changes from 2021 and 2022 that you referenced, and because it does make individual player analysis so interesting. And Ben, I've always pushed back a little bit, in part from just a fun perspective. I don't really enjoy playing fantasy football from a pure portfolio viewpoint. I don't like just trying to go through drafts and selecting whoever the ADP value is and building a structure. I mean, we've talked about structure forever and been very heavy on that, but it's not something where I'm going to go player agnostic and just say, okay, whatever the best ADP value is that make the structure work. If you don't feel like you have insights or that you have done the mental work, you don't have to spend hours and hours on it either. You don't have to have read tons and tons of people. I think you can actually get a lot worse by reading too many people, because even if a lot of that information is good, you end up too watered down in terms of how you see all of these players. You're getting opposing viewpoints on them that cancel each other out. You haven't decided which one wins. And then you go back to just basically picking, okay, these are the ADP values. 2023 is so much fun because there is so much to sift through. You need to be humble enough that you're going to understand that you're going to get some of the takes wrong, but you have to have this portfolio that, again, I mean, Ben, you and I and the Fantasy Douche and many others at RotoViz have talked about from the beginning with the asymmetrical upside, that you structured it so that your wins are much greater than your losses. And that is based on individual player analysis. And I think that's, what so many of us are in fantasy football for. And you look at the articles that do well at RotoViz. I mean, sure, we got great tools for helping you win best ball, for doing structure, for doing all those different kinds of things, but people want to know about the players. I mean, you don't turn on the TV on Sunday just be like, my portfolio of 150 teams that's well balanced is going to do whatever happens this Sunday, and I don't care. I mean, once you've gotten to that point, you've sort of removed fantasy football as fun. So 2023 is perfect for having the maximum amount of enjoyment in this hobby.
It is. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot. You can definitely take stance, and it's interesting. Shawn, we talked about 2022 offseason being like the most tumultuous in NFL history. We talked about it last offseason. This time last year, we were saying it's so hard to analyze half of the teams in the league because they had some major change in how they're going to do things because of the Tyreek Hill and AJ Brown and Devonta Adams and Russell Wilson and Deshaun Watson trades all around the league last year. So many players, high-profile players, changing teams. And then the 2022 season features very different stats in the ways that we talked about. We have the rushing efficiency increasing, passing falling, defenses finding effective ways to operate within the current NFL climate where, a lot of the rules do favor the offense. And it's sort of like we had, one season of data in this new reality that I think is, your best guess about what the 2023 reality is going to be like, at least early in the year. And we have different offenses that, we have one season of data on how the players fit together and all of those things. I mean, there's things that the market has not even considered. Like you mentioned the Dolphins. I'm with you. I think the Dolphins are going to be okay. I think there's a real risk there as well, though. You look down the stretch, they weren't as efficient. You look at that Chargers game, I know I've referenced before, where Staley took away the middle of the field, made Tua throw deep out patterns, and he went 10 for 28. I've had people reference Tyreek Hill's production, during that stretch. And one of the things is in that game, he picked up that fumble and ran it for like 60 yards and scored a touchdown. Do you remember that wild play? So there's point just being there's, a lot in small samples that, I would obviously expect him to have a fumble recovery for a touchdown every 4 games or whatever, which in that 4-game sample, he did have one. So anyway, it's a challenging thing to parse these small samples. I think we have a small sample of the current NFL paradigm. I think we have a small sample of the current roster in a lot of cities. Whereas for a long time, you had Drew Brees in New Orleans, and we knew what that team was. We had, Tom Brady in New England, and we had a pretty good idea of how that team would look. There are elements like that. We know what the Chiefs are going to look like with Patrick Mahomes, usually. We know what the Bills are probably going to look like. I feel pretty confident in knowing what the Eagles are going to look like, even though that's really only one season there. I mean, they might not be able to carry it over against a tougher schedule this year. The small samples, the uncertainty of the 2022 offseason and NFL season, it all sets up to make 2023 a year where there's just not it's just going to be a fun one to track, like you said.
It's going to be fantastic. And you mentioned Tua's injury there, or Tua and the situation with the Dolphins. One of the things that Blair mentioned in his recent article on the quarterback window is that QB injuries and the missed games, that was sort of the worst situation that we've had in a decade. And obviously, as teams are trying to adjust to this new passing defense environment, if you're doing it with your backup QB, the numbers are going to be ugly, which they were. I'm hoping for a little bit of a bounce back there. We want to see fun football. We think we're going to get that one way or another. We can't wait. That'll do it for today's episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch. You want to make sure you get over there and sign up for Stealing Signals. Ben has a lot more August content coming for you. Stealing Lines, getting fired back up in a big way. His project with Dalton Cates. You want to sign up for that as well. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. Use the coupon code RVRadio2023 at checkout for a 10% discount on your 1-year subscription. Join us at Underdog. The coupon code there is RotoViz, 100% match up to $100. Leave us a rating and review. It really helps us with the algorithm. We appreciate everything you guys have done from that perspective. We love you. We'll talk to you soon.